Okay, welcome everybody. Today is July 12th, 2022, and today's subject is going to be a refresher on the UUID, or Universally Unique Identifier, presented by Josh Legler. These presentations are these chats are supposed to be conversations. So if you have a question or clarification you would like, please make sure that you make use of the chat window or come off of mute and ask your questions. But with that, no further ado here, we'll turn things over to Josh. Go ahead.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Kelly Clark had asked if this is being recorded, and I believe it is.
Yes, it will be recorded and then be up on our website and our YouTube channel either by the end of the day or first thing tomorrow.
Great. All right, well, welcome everyone. We have a good sized group this morning for this UUID refresher. The UUID was introduced in NEMSIS 3.5 when it was, back in like 2016 is when the conversation started. And then NEMSIS 3.5 came out in 2019, was finalized then. And this training today is meant to be kind of a refresher. We'll go a little bit into the technical, but a lot more into the what does it mean for me from a state data perspective. So the main audience today is going to be state data managers, but I think there will be plenty of useful information for everyone, whether it's at the agency level or vendors or whoever else. Also, I want to mention that I am just happy to be interrupted anytime as Chris said, to have this be a two-way conversation. So feel free to interrupt me just in the middle of the presentation anytime. If you have a question or a comment, you can take yourself off mute and speak up. You can put something in the chat, and Chris and I will both be watching that. So don't hesitate. Don't feel like you have to save questions for the end. Okay, so let's take a look at our agenda here. If I can get my clicks to work. Okay, so we're first going to say what is a UUID, a little bit of a refresher on that. Then where are the UUIDs in the NEMSIS 3.5 standard? What problems do the UUIDs solve and what problems do they not solve? And finally, a little bit of a dive into the patient care report UUID. That's what we're looking at for today. So first, what is a UUID? I'm going to scroll you through the official international standard for UUIDs, the RFC 4122. This is an international standard, outside of NEMSIS, that defines what a universally unique identifier is. These are also known as globally unique identifiers, GUIDs or GUIDs. So all of those are synonymous with each other. If you hear UUID, you hear GUID, that's the same thing. There's this important piece I highlighted that a UUID can guarantee uniqueness across space and time. We're going to look a little bit at that. In the motivation for the standard, there's this thing they wrote. They said no centralized authority is required to administer UUIDs. That's a really important concept. So they came up with an algorithm so that any software system anywhere in the universe, I guess, at least in the world, can generate a UUID using the algorithm. And it's guaranteed that no other software product in any other location at any other time has ever generated that same UUID, nor will it ever generate that same UUID in the future. And so because of that, it means that we don't have to have a single entity somewhere that hands out UUIDs and says, okay, I'm minting a UUID and I'm handing it to this requester and to another one to this other requester. UUIDs can be generated locally, anywhere, anytime, without having a collision of two different things having the same UUID. So no centralized authority is required. That's real important. And because of that, then we have this concept that they talked about here, that a UUID is an identifier that is unique across both time and space. So it doesn't matter where or when a UUID is generated. When it's generated according to their algorithm, it's unique. That same value will never be generated again any other place, any other time, until maybe after we get to AD 3400. So that's about 1400 years from now. Then there might be a rollover in one of the algorithm options. So we're not going to worry about that. I think we're good for the next little while. Okay, so let's create some UUIDs. I'm just going to this website here called UUID Generator, and it gave me a UUID. And I can sit here all day long and just generate UUIDs. And I'm never going to get the same value generated twice. They're always going to be unique. And all of you could go to this same page and you could sit here all day long refreshing it. We could do this for the rest of our lives and keep going for another few thousand years after that. And we would just never get the same value generated twice. It will never happen. So that's the uniqueness aspect of these UUIDs. Okay, these are the elements in the NEMSIS standard that have UUIDs attached to them. And in a minute, we're going to talk about why we adopted UUIDs in NEMSIS 3.5. But what you'll notice about all of these is that they are quote unquote group elements. So you see in DEM dataset, there's lots of different group elements that have a UUID attribute attached to them. And all of these are a group of data elements that can repeat within an agency. So for example, the agency service group indicates a state that an agency serves along with the counties, census tracts, and zip codes within that state that that agency serves. And an agency may serve one state, and then it may also serve a second or a third state with counties, census tracts, and zip codes within that state. So that is a repeatable group. And so each of those groups now will have a UUID attached to it that uniquely identifies that object representing the state that the agency serves. Same thing for the agency year group. They could have agency stats for 2015, 2016, 2017, et cetera, through 2021 and on into the future. So there will be a unique ID, a UUID attached to each of those groups. And the same thing, for example, with vehicles. We're going to look at vehicles a little bit today as kind of our example area. And each vehicle that an agency utilizes, the information about that vehicle will have a universally unique ID attached to it. On the EMS dataset side, there's only one element that has a UUID, and is the patient care report. Of course, as we know, an agency can have multiple patient care reports. And of course, every agency does have multiple patient care reports. And so each of those patient care reports has its own UUID assigned. And then, of course, there's all kinds of data within that patient care report about the EMS call. Okay, so what does this look like in the XML and in the data dictionary? Here's the XML view. I'm using a vehicle here. So we have the dvehicle section, and then we have a dvehicle.vehicle group, and you'll see that it has this attribute called UUID right there on that vehicle group. And that uniquely identifies this chunk of data and kind of encompassing all of these child elements that are within that vehicle group that are explaining or giving information about the vehicle that the agency owns. So that's where it shows up in the XML. And then in the data dictionary, you're going to see it in these menu areas. Like if you went to the dvehicle section of the data dictionary, before you click into any individual data element, you're going to see this hierarchical view here. And what you'll notice, according to the legend, is that a U indicates that there's a UUID on that element. So here we see dvehicle.vehicle group has a U next to it. So that is a group element We can see it is repeatable. It can happen multiple times within an agency, and so it has a UUID attribute. Within that vehicle, then we see that there's a vehicle certification levels group. That's something that can happen multiple times within a vehicle. You could have a certain number of EMTs and a certain number of paramedics who are configured to ride on that vehicle, to staff that vehicle. And so because this is a repeatable group, it also has a UUID on it to uniquely identify that data object that could occur multiple times. Okay, so that's where you'll see it in the data dictionaries, is those U's labeled there. Okay, any questions at this point on just like what is a UUID and where it's going to show up in the NEMSIS 3.5 data standard? Any questions on those things I've shown so far? Okay, sounds good. So what's the problem that we're solving here? Why did we add these UUIDs to the NEMSIS 3.5 data standard? So I mentioned at the beginning, this concept was proposed way back in 2016 by vendors. And the end result here, really, the goal that we're achieving by adding UUIDs is that now state data systems can accept agency demographic data from agencies without making a big mess. That's the end goal. That's what it's all about. State data managers, you know what the big mess was and it is. If you accepted demographic data submissions through a web services process from agency software products into your state system, you often dealt with challenges of data being duplicated, objects being duplicated, or objects that went away in the agency, but they never went away in your state system. So you would have, for example, the agency, has these 4 vehicles that they run with. They updated some of the data about one of those vehicles, and all of a sudden the state system now has 5 vehicles, even though the agency really only has 4 vehicles in real life. You saw it a lot with personnel. The agency had 20 personnel, but over time, as they kept making little changes to names or corrections to birth dates or contact info, whatever it might be, the state system all of a sudden had 30 or 40 or 50 personnel. And as you look through your list, you saw that they were duplicates of each other. You had 2 or 3 or 4 of the same person in that agency with just slightly different details about them. So the UUID was adopted to solve that problem, so that when an agency submits demographic data to the state, they submit those updates. The state system has an easier time processing that data and identifying what was added, what was changed, and what was removed from the agency demographic data set. I will note that even with NEMSIS 3.4 and prior, there were ways to deal with it successfully. So this is not necessarily a problem where the UUID was the only way to solve it. There were some good data warehousing principles that helped back in the pre-3.5 days. But what we saw was that they tended to not be implemented very much. And they were fairly complex as well. So the UUID greatly simplifies things for the vendors of state level data systems. All right. Any questions about this, like what we're trying to solve and the idea that now as states you can start accepting demographic data in 3.5 from your agencies? Any questions or discussion or comments on that? Jeff said, does this mean that the vendors/users have to make sure the UUID stays with the correct person/vehicle/whatnot all? Yes. And that is mainly the responsibility of the collect data vendors to assign a UUID when an object is first created in your data system. And that UUID is persistent. You keep that UUID attached to that record. What would be kind of outside of the responsibility of a local vendor is if an agency deleted one of their vehicles and then they created a new vehicle that in the real world was actually the same vehicle as before. There's nothing a local vendor could do about that. But the UUID even helps there because the state system will recognize that the old object went away and a new object was created, so we don't have to create a duplicate. Okay, let's take a look at the old way versus the new way and what was happening, kind of dive into this a little more. So here's the old way. An agency would do a demographic data submission to a state. And let's say that it contained these 4 vehicle objects in the demographic data. And you'll notice the 4th vehicle object, it really didn't contain much data, but it was there. And the state system had to do something with it. And so the state system would go ahead and populate its database with, that's the first submission. The state data system would populate its database with those 4 vehicles. Okay, then later a second submission comes in from the agency. And it contains some stuff that's kind of the same, kind of different. You'll notice like unit number A1 is now called Medic 2 and A2 is called Medic 1. So they were probably just swapping some call signs there. This last one is a motorcycle called Bike 12. It has a unit number now. We don't really know if that was replacing this other vehicle or if they just finally filled in the data on that vehicle and it's really just an update of that other vehicle. The engine here, it changed from E6 to E7. So was that, did they retire engine 6 and add engine 7 or did they renumber it? You just don't really know. Well, here's what would happen in the state system. The state system would just add these 4 new vehicles from that latest data submission. And now the state data system has 8 vehicles listed for this agency. It's got A1 and A2 with Medic 1 and Medic 2, but it's also got A1 and A2 with Medic 2 and Medic 1. It's got engine 6, it's got engine 7, it's got that other that was mostly blank. It's got the motorcycle. They're all in there. This is not reflecting what is actually the current snapshot of the agency, right? The current snapshot of the agency is only these last 4 here, but the state system just doesn't know, do I update A1? Do I update E6? Do I inactivate it? Do I add a new one? Just didn't really know how to handle it. Like I said, there were ways to handle it consistently. But it'll be a lot easier with the UUID, and here's how it's going to look. Okay, the first submission from this agency, it comes in with these 4 vehicles. Each of those vehicles has a universally unique identifier assigned to that data object representing that vehicle. And I've just abbreviated here to the first 4 characters of the UUIDs, but they'll be the full, 36 characters long. And so then when the second data submission comes in, the state system receiving and processing this data can look here and say, okay, the first object was the information about A1. It's that UUID, the one that starts with C3A6. So that's an update because I already know about that UUID. I already have that object in my state database. So I'm going to update the data to reflect the current information about it. So I'm going to change the call sign from Medic 1 to Medic 2. And it'll recognize the same sort of situation with this vehicle identified by the UUID that starts with 9A9D, and it'll make an update. It'll see this new UUID here that it hadn't seen before that starts with EEBE. And so it says, oh, this is a new object. And so I'm going to create an object in the state system database to hold this data here about engine 7 that the agency has. And at the bottom, the 4th one, 30C1. Oh, I've seen 30C1 before. That was that one that was just marked as an other type and didn't really have any other data about it. But now I know it's an update to that existing record. They've filled in the rest of the data. It's a motorcycle, it's Bike 12. I'm going to go ahead and do the update to that existing object in the database. Okay, what about engine 6 here? The UUID starting with 1094. The state system can see that that UUID no longer exists in the list of vehicles that the agency submitted today. So the state system can go ahead and inactivate that record in the state database, indicating that that agency no longer actively utilizes that vehicle. So in the end, this is what we get. We get 4 vehicles, after that second submission has been done. We get 4 vehicles in the state system, which matches what the agency has. They have 4 vehicles. The information about those vehicles is all up to date, matching what the agency had. And the state system has marked 1 record inactive. Now they could delete it too, but usually the approach is to just mark things inactive. And so we know that this agency used to have engine 6, but today it does not have engine 6. That's not currently being used by that agency. So that's how the UUID helps. It serves as a unique key for each of these data objects, and helps the state system to track what was added, what changed, and what was removed. Any questions on that process and how that's going to be cleaner, how that's going to affect state systems? Zach said, is this all done on submission of an application from the agency? This is done in the agency demographic data submission to the state. So all of you at the state level are receiving patient care report data from your agencies every day, right? That's the hundreds of thousands of records that are coming in. The patient care reports are in the EMS data set. But the DEM data set is the agency demographic data. There's that whole chunk of the data dictionary that talks about agency demographic data. And the idea is, and really the requirement from NEMSIS, is that that demographic data should be getting submitted from the agency to the state on a regular basis. Whenever they make changes in their agency, they hire new personnel, they make changes to their vehicles, whatever it might be, there should be a resubmission of that demographic data from the agency to the state through a web services process. Now, if an agency is directly using your state system, then they're adding those people or there's those vehicles, et cetera, through a web interface in your state system, and that's fine. But if they're using their own software product, then they should be keeping that product up to date. They obviously need to add their personnel so that they can put them as crew members on calls. And so as they keep that up to date in their local system, you want to make sure that those updates make it to the state system, that the state system knows what the agency has in their local system. So that's the demographic data update. And it's snapshot data rather than event data like a patient care report. Zachary, I hope that answered the question, but feel free to ask a clarifying question if you need to. Okay, so summing up the requirements here for UUIDs in NEMSIS 3.5, one is that they're mandatory. So I showed you that XML code snippet with the UUID attribute with a value in there. That cannot be empty in NEMSIS 3.5. Every object that has a UUID attribute, the UUID must be there. If it was not mandatory, then we would just lose all the value, the intended value of having new UUID. The UUIDs are auto-generated by collect data systems. So they're not generated by state systems, the exception being that if you're using your state system as a collect data system, so you have agencies that are directly doing data entry on it, then it's operating as a collect data system and it's going to be generating UUIDs. The UUIDs are generated where the initial record is created in that agency level system. And then that UUID gets used through the chain at the state level and at the national level as data gets pushed up. Collect data systems are required to make sure that that UUID never changes. It has no business meaning, so that helps, right? So you're never going to have to correct a UUID because it had the wrong year or the wrong time zone or whatever else, because it's completely meaningless. It's randomly generated according to the algorithm. And so it just stays the same over time. So those are the kind of a quick summary of the requirements. There is a NEMSIS 3.5 UUID guide on the guides and usage page of the NEMSIS website that kind of dives into all the technical details. I do want to give you a couple notes about UUID Scope, and I want to make sure that these are very clearly understood. The first is that UUIDs identify data objects or records. Those data objects or records, they represent real-world things, but they are not actually real-world things. So let me draw an example. Let's say an agency adds me as a personnel on their personnel list. They go into their agency data system and they say, I want to add a personnel. At that moment, their agency data system is going to generate a UUID for that personnel record. And then they're going to type in, the name and birth date and license number and all that stuff about me as a personnel in their agency. That UUID is not identifying me as a person. In other words, I don't walk around the world with my UUID tattooed on my chest. That UUID is not me. That UUID is attached to an object or a record in a database, and that record is describing information about a person who works for the agency as one of their personnel. So it's about my association with that agency. It's not actually identifying me. That's really important to understand on the patient care report side too. The UUID is not a patient identifier. It does not identify a real world patient. It is only a record identifier. It identifies a patient care report. It just identifies that record that was created, and it serves no purpose to identify a patient. Second, the uniqueness aspect of a UUID is universal. So in other words, as I said earlier, when a UUID is generated, no one will ever generate that same value ever across time or space. Well, maybe in 1400 years from now. So that value is universally unique. There will never be another record in NEMSIS or in anywhere else in the world that has that particular value for its UUID. However, in the NEMSIS 3.5 standard, we have scoped the identification aspect of a UUID to be within an agency using a particular software product, the agency software product combo. Okay, so an agency is using XYZ software. They're setting it up. They're adding all their personnel and their vehicles. The software that they're using is generating the UUIDs for all those personnel and all those vehicles. Another agency using another software product is doing the same thing, adding all their personnel, their vehicles, et cetera. And let's say Josh Legler works for both of those agencies. Well, each agency using its software product is going to create a personnel record for my association with that agency. And each agency's software product is going to create its own UUID to represent that data record. Okay, so I'm the same person working for two different agencies using two different software products. Because the identification aspect of the UUID is scoped to be within the agency software product combo, it means that this does not in any way help to identify that I'm the same person working for those two different agencies. Oh, let me see. Oh, sorry. Thanks, Chris. I think we took care of the feedback. This does not identify that I'm the same person working in those two different agencies. I have a different UUID in each agency representing the data record about my association with that agency. Now, it's kind of interesting, though, at the national EMS database level, that there's some interesting stuff that could happen. Actually, I've got a question about it later, so I'll ask you the question a little later, and we see how it works out. Also, if there's two agencies using the same installation of the same software product, then it is potentially the case that they could have a centralized personnel database in that product, and it assigns a UUID to a personnel record. And then that same UUID could show up in the two different agencies. That would be okay. We wouldn't have a uniqueness problem here because it's scoped within each agency. So if each agency had the same person working for them and they used the same UUID as the other agency used to represent that personnel record, that's not a problem. That is allowed. Okay, so I hope that didn't get too philosophical or whatever. Any questions? Anything you want to clarify on these notes here? Okay. All right, so let's cover here the things that the UUIDs do not solve. And the first one I think is clear from the explanation I just gave. UUIDs do not identify real-world entities across agencies. At least that's not their purpose in NEMSIS. So the fact that the same person works for two different agencies, they might get a different UUID assigned to them, to their personnel record in those two different agencies, unless maybe those agencies share a data system like I described. If there's a vehicle that's used by one agency and then they sell it to another agency, again, the UUID is not attached to the real world vehicle. It's just attached to the record within that agency that describes their use of that vehicle. So the new agency is going to create a new vehicle object in their data system, and it's going to get a new UUID assigned to it. It doesn't matter that the real world actual piece of metal was the same thing. It also doesn't solve switching vendors. So there is not a requirement for collect data vendors to be able to ingest NEMSIS data. They are only required to be able to output NEMSIS data. So because of that, there's no requirement that when an agency switches to a new system that they have to export their demographic data from their old system and import it into their new system. Now, just because there's no requirement doesn't mean it can't be done. So they may do that. And in fact, it would be really nice if they do. So it is something that would be encouraged, but not required. When they switch vendors, it is possible that they could just type in everything from scratch in their new system, and it's just going to generate all new UUIDs. When that gets sent to the state system is going to see that lots of stuff went away and lots of new stuff got added, and that's okay too. All right, so I've really kind of focused on the demographic data here. And I know that in the back of your mind, you're probably thinking, but what about patient care reports? They have UUIDs too. But demographic data is actually the bulk of the purpose of UUIDs, and that's where the bulk of the UUIDs live. So before I switch to patient care reports, any questions or discussion on demographic data and UUIDs? Okay.
Have there been any questions or conversations with like licensing software products? I know some states probably connect their licensing system straight into their patient care system. So would the licensing system be able to assign these type of UUIDs for vehicles and then directly import that into the patient care software? Does that make sense?
Yeah, Amber, that's a great question. Let's dive into that a little bit. So let's take a scenario where an agency is using a third-party software product in your state, and they're submitting data to your state ePCR system. And then your state also has a licensing system that's tracking personnel and vehicles and other things about the agency. And that licensing system is sending data to your PCR system as well. So your ePCR system is kind of sitting in the middle, and it's getting data from both sources potentially. I think today you're probably just not receiving it from the agency through demographic data. You're probably only receiving it through licensing. Is that your current scenario today?
That's a theoretical future scenario.
Oh, okay, got it. All right. And so let's say that you've got the licensing system and the state ePCR system integrated, and they're sending data. But you want to start receiving data from agency demographic data submissions so that you'll get all the stuff that's not in your licensing system. You'll also be able to do data quality checks on what the agency is sending you to know that their system is set up correctly, all of that. So you have to remember that the UUIDs will be generated in the NEMSIS world. They'll be generated by the agency's data system. Now, your licensing system is also generating UUIDs of its own for all of those records. Most mature systems use this UUID approach. So what happens then is the agency sends in demographic data and it's got UUIDs attached to all those. We'll take the vehicles, for example. It's usually a pretty short list. So it's got these half a dozen vehicles. They each have a UUID attached to them. Your licensing system, since you're licensing or permitting those vehicles, it also has generated UUIDs in the licensing system for those vehicle data objects. They're not the same values, they're different because they were generated by two different products at different times. They're representing the same real world vehicles. So what happens then is those both come into your state ePCR system, and there will need to be an initial synchronization that happens there. And this is one of those problems that UUIDs does not solve. So you got 6 vehicles from licensing, you've got 6 from their demographic data submission. Your ePCR system needs to initially map those 6 to 6. You know, they need to kind of map them to each other, essentially create, it's like a lookup table or crosswalk that says this UUID coming from the agency's software product matches up with this UUID that came from licensing. Once it's made that initial match, then it can keep track of changes to those vehicles over time, regardless of which system they came from. But that initial match could be, you know, that's something to really watch, because otherwise you're just going to get 8, you know, or 12 vehicles, which you don't want in your ePCR system.
Is there a world where someone might recommend to only receive data from one source, say from the licensing system, and not allow the import of demographic files from agencies?
Yes, or I think a little more mature approach that I would recommend. There is information in the agency DEM data set that's probably not in your licensing system. It would be nice to get that data into your ePCR system. And also, I think it's really important, if you receive demographic data from agencies, then you can validate that data. It tells you whether they've set up their local system correctly. And if they've got a personnel in there with a bad license number, then when they send you PCR data, you're going to have all these PCRs with a bad license number in them, and you're not going to know who that belongs to. If they've sent you the demographic data with the bad license number, you can have an error or a warning there and prompt them to fix that bad license number, that kind of stuff. And so what I would recommend is a more mature approach is that you might decide which pieces of data, which data elements are processed from which source. So you'll say, for example, the agency name is, we're going to process that from the licensing data. That's the official record of source. And so when an agency submits demographic data, it's going to include their agency name because it's just in there, but we're not going to process that particular data element. However, we are going to process their service area or their annual stats or whatever it is that you might want to process. So in other words, I would recommend having a state system that's configurable on that incoming data interface to say, these are the data elements that we will process from an agency submitting demographic data, and these are the elements that we won't process. We'll just ignore them.
Do you have any idea if state systems have that functionality now?
I've heard rumors of it, but I don't know if anything, I haven't seen any official documentation about such a feature yet. Any state system vendors who would care to speak to that concept? I know it puts you on the spot, but.
Amber, I'm sorry. I heard like half of your question. Would you repeat your last question, Amber?
Yeah, so I think Josh was alluding to a capability where for DEM files, you could, if I'm understanding correctly, and Josh, please feel free to correct me, you could specify the source of certain elements. So say if we just wanted to receive agency name from like our LMS system, but we wanted to receive other data elements from the agency's DEM file, like maybe personnel information. Did I understand you correctly, Josh?
Yeah, so the ability to configure the processing of demographic data from third-party products to only process certain elements in that data and ignore other elements.
Amber, this is.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, I can speak to that a little bit from how LMS and specifically from the image trend side of things and how LMS is handling that syncing process today. There is a bidirectional syncing configuration interface that we have that lets you specify which data you want to either have incoming or outgoing within the systems between the image trend systems. Now that doesn't get into the agency demographic file imports as a secondary consideration there. But if you're syncing from one image trend system to the other, you can configure that for which fields you want to send and receive, and therefore you could say which one was the system of record.
Yeah, so the idea here would be to have that same sort of configuration that applies to the interface between an agency data system and the state ePCR system as data comes in through that interface.
Hey, Josh, I have a question for you too.
Yeah.
Does NEMSIS provide any official guidance or suggestions for state vendors on how to handle like vehicles or personnel that have already previously been imported for like 3.4? And then would the state vendor assign the UUID? And then how would the collect agency get that UUID back so that those two systems match? Do you guys provide any guidance on that workflow?
Yeah, so let's say the state system already has a bunch of objects in there because they were submitted through NEMSIS 3.4. So they don't have any UUIDs attached to them. Obviously, your state system has generated its own UUIDs for those database records, but the agency system knows nothing about those UUIDs. And so the first time that the agency submits NEMSIS 3.5 data, it's again that concept I was talking about of having to do that initial connection. That, okay, now we've received a bunch of vehicles with UUIDs. You're going to have to make that initial setup there. And it may involve a person looking through the lists to say, okay, yeah, these 4 vehicles match up in this way with the 4 existing ones that we have that didn't have UUIDs because they were pre-NEMSIS 3.5. Once that has been established the first time, then you're good. You know, in the future that the agency can keep submitting and you'll know what to do with those UUIDs. So that unfortunately is there is no possible way to solve that problem other than to do some analysis or have some automated logic that tries to match those up that first time. And I think some of that's described in the UUID guide and the demographic data processing guide as well.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Great questions. Other questions at this point?
I'm full of questions today, apparently.
All right.
When do we expect these requirements changes to be implemented? Because I heard you say that they're mandatory. However, I'm under the impression that new DEM files are not required for the 3.5 transition. So when will this actually happen?
Right. Okay. So they are a mandatory component of NEMSIS 3.5. So if an agency submits a record to you that has a UUID attribute in as part of its definition in 3.5, that UUID attribute has to be there and it has to have a value that is valid. The national database is NEMSIS TAC has said you can start submitting NEMSIS 3.5 PCRs without having to first submit NEMSIS 3.5 demographic data for the agency if you've already submitted NEMSIS 3.4 demographic data for that agency in the past. So that's a requirement of the national EMS database. But the standard itself is if you're using NEMSIS 3.5, you're using UUIDs and they are mandatory.
Okay, because, sorry, dumbed down question, because the information captured in the PCR utilizes these UUIDs from the DEM file. Is that how it has to be done? Sorry.
No, it actually does not. So the UUIDs in the DEM file are solely for the purpose of tracking changes to those demographic objects over time, just so that when the agency submits every month or every few days or whatever, the state system can recognize what was added, changed, or removed in demographic data. It's solely that scope.
Okay, so they could have a 3, like their latest DEM file could still have been 3.4, but they could be submitting 3.5 patient care reports.
Yeah, at a state level, you could decide what your requirements would be around that.
Okay, thanks. That is incredibly helpful.
Okay, great. Okay, so let's take a few minutes to talk about the PCR UUID. So there is one object in EMS dataset that has a UUID, and it is the patient care report object. So I've highlighted here in the data dictionary, that one U right there. That's the only one that shows up in the EMS dataset. Now, to kind of speak to Amber's question, right? We don't, for example, identify the crew members or the vehicle that was on the call or any of that by their UUID here within the patient care report. That's still done the way it's always been done. So just the patient care report itself gets a UUID attribute added to it. It is just like in demographic data, it's an attribute on the patient care report data element. So that's how it shows up in the XML data right there. And then below that, you'll have your eRecord.01 and other, all the rest of the report. And it serves as part of the PCR identifier. So prior to NEMSIS 3.5, the PCR identifier was the combination of the agency unique state ID, the agency number, and the state. Now, state data managers, you often may have overlooked that third one because every agency in your state was in your state and it was the same state. But nationally, it's important to remember that the PCR identifier does include the state as well as the agency identifiers, plus eRecord.01, the patient care report number. And then there were some issues over the years. For example, when an agency switched from one software product to another, there was no requirement for what a patient care report number looked like or how it should be formatted. So if it was just a simple sequence, or if it was like a year, month, day with some sequence after that, whatever, you could have a scenario where an agency switched software products and then the new software product just kind of started the sequence over. And it generated its own patient care report numbers that happened to be duplicates of patient care report numbers that had been generated by the previous system that agency used. Things like that that cropped up. And so what happened was the national EMS database, they implemented a larger collection of elements to identify a PCR. They added in the EMS unit call sign and the unit notified by dispatch date time as additional identifiers for uniqueness. So what it meant was in the national database, you could have the same PCR number and state and agency number and ID more than one time, but they might have a different unit call sign or a different unit notified time. What we ended up with then was duplicates got created easily. So an agency might submit this record here, and then they might resubmit this record later. And all they had done is they had corrected their time zone. In fact, it was just daylight saving time, right? They forgot to indicate that they were in daylight saving time. And so they resubmit the same record with a corrected time zone on the end of etimes.03. And what you ended up with in your state system and in the national database was two records that were exact duplicates of each other, except that etimes.03 was slightly different. And it wasn't even the date or the hours or minutes or seconds that was different. It was only the time zone offset that was different. But any kind of change to that value, it resulted in a duplicate. So we're getting away from that with NEMSIS 3.5 by adding the UUID. So, if in the old way, if you didn't include eResponse 14 and eTimes03 in your record key, then you'd be okay, right? You would end up with a single record that got updated with the new time zone, and that's what you actually wanted. But instead, you got duplicates. So it was solvable in the old way, but with the UUID, it's much more straightforward. Okay, so in 3.5, we still have, remember, UUIDs are always scoped within an agency. So we still have the agency state ID number and state as part of the PCR identifier, plus the patient care report UUID, which takes the place of patient care report number. Now, patient care report number is still in the data set, but it'll no longer be used as the unique identifier for a PCR when trying to figure out, is this a new record or is this an update to an existing record? The UUID will be used for that. The value here is that the UUID has those strict requirements around its formatting and generation, the algorithm that's used. So we know for sure that if an agency switches software products or anything else they might do, they're never going to have two different patient care reports with the same UUID assigned to them. It'll never happen. So because of that, we don't need to worry about these extra identifiers that made things pretty messy. And the way that'll look then is they submit a record. It has a certain UUID on it. It's also got this combination of agency number and state. Later, they submit an update to that record. Well, nothing has changed in the key, right? It's other stuff that changed. So the state system, the national database, they recognize that this is an update to an existing record. So in the end, they only have one instance of this record in their database. There's a couple things to keep in mind here. And one is that if the agency ID or agency number is changed, and then that record is resubmitted, that is seen as being a PCR that's in a different agency. And so that will create a new record because it's a different agency. They're always scoped within the agency. So keep that in mind if you're like changing agency numbers and stuff. You want to coordinate that with the agency so that you're changing that identifier in both your state system and their local system, so that when they submit data after the change, you're seeing it as being the same agency. Okay, what is the PCR identifier not? It's not a patient identifier. It does not identify your patients. It is also not an event or incident identifier. Use the incident number for that. It is only a record identifier. It identifies the patient care report about that event. And it is not a magic link to other data, kind of the holy grail of data linkage, but it can be a link, maybe just not magic. For example, linking with the National Trauma Database data, there's a white paper that's been put out about that. It includes the UUID. The important thing to note here is that there's a trauma registrar sitting here pulling that EMS record in. And that EMS record has a UUID, so that gets pulled in and attached to the trauma record. So it's kind of automatic, but there was a person making a decision that this patient care report represents the care that was given to this same trauma patient. It's connected. There's someone who was connecting it in the first place. Once they've done that, then upstream, everything kind of works nicely. The UUID lives with both the patient care report and the trauma record. And so later on, even after de-identification is done, that patient care report and that trauma record could still be connected back to each other for doing outcomes research. So it's not magic. Okay, I want to end with a couple questions here. We're pretty short on time. First question, what's wrong with this description? This is a description of a data element in the National Trauma Data Standard. It's in the 2022 Data Dictionary. And the description they gave is that the EMS Patient Care Report UUID is the patient's universally unique identifier as assigned by the EMS agency transporting the patient to your hospital. Can someone tell me what's wrong with this description? What is incorrect about it? Amber, you got it right away. This is not the patient's universally unique identifier. It does not belong to the patient. So how would we correct this description? Okay, let's try this. Yeah, change patient to PCR. Okay, so patient is the problem there. This is what we proposed to NTDS, and this is what they'll probably have in their 2023 data dictionary. The UUID of the patient care report of each EMS unit treating the patient beginning at the scene of injury until arrival at your hospital. So they will recognize that it's not a UUID for the patient, it's for the EMS PCR. And on top of that, they're going to recognize that there were multiple PCRs involved in that trauma event. And each of those PCRs could have its own UUID that a local hospital or a state might want to track. You might want to know all the PCRs associated with that trauma record. So that'll be the fix there. Okay, second question. What happens when an agency operates in two states? They send the same PCR to both states, and then both states send that same PCR to the national database. Can anyone unmute or comment in the chat? What's that going to look like in the national database? How many records will be there? What will they look like? So one agency, it's in two states, sends it to both states send it to national. Okay, since we're a little short on time, I'll show you the answer here. They send it to state number 1. And so the unique identifier for the PCR is this combination of D agency 01, 2, and 4, right? 4 is the state in which they operate, plus the PCR UUID. They send the same record to the second state. That agency probably has a different state ID in that second state. They probably have a separate license number in that second state, and definitely a different state ID, or a different state, right? So one's Missouri, the other's Kentucky, whatever it might be. The PCR UUID is the same, but this is seen in the national database as 2 PCRs because the total key here is different. It's a different agency number in a different state. So the national database will have 2 records. But what's interesting here is that both of those PCRs will in fact have the same UUID. So at the national database level, they're keeping 2 different records because they give data back to the states, and they need to be able to show Missouri what data they submitted. And they also need to be able to show Kansas what data they submitted. So they've got to keep those 2 records in those 2 states. But if they wanted to identify or deduplicate in the national database, it would be possible to do so. It would be possible to recognize that this is actually the same agency operating in 2 different states. And this was in fact the same single patient care report. We just have 2 records of it in the national database. Okay, and then I think this will relate to Amber's question here. Are NEMSIS compliant systems prohibited from showing UUIDs to users? And we are right at time. So in sake of time, the answer in the UUID guide is that UUIDs should not involve end users. They should not be required to interact with them. They certainly should not be typing them in because they have to be generated using an algorithm. However, they can be made visible, especially to system administrator users for managing their systems. So in answer to Amber's question, yeah, it would be wise for you to have access to the UUID as an element you could report on and be able to handle deduplication efforts with that. Just not something that EMT should need to worry about. Okay, I think we ran out of time for final Q&A here, but I'm glad that we had some questions coming in throughout the session that we got to address. And just wanted to recap or look through. Okay, there was a question from Bada. If multiple agencies attended the same event and generated 2 UUIDs, then which UUID would the trauma registry use? Today, it would be the UUID for the PCR that represented the transport to the reporting hospital. But starting next year, with the proposed change, the trauma registry would be able to handle all of the UUIDs from all of the PCRs of the agencies involved in that event. Okay, we're right at time. I'll stick around to answer any final questions that people might have, but I'll let you all go. Chris, any final comments?
No, thanks, Josh. A big virtual round of applause for Josh. Thank you so much for the information. Just want to let everybody know that this session was recorded, will be available on our website and on our YouTube channel. And if you want to be notified about more presentations like this and information that NEMSIS has going on, please make sure that you sign up for our Google group mailing list and on our social media at Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter. But other than that, we're done with the presentation. But Josh, like he said, he's happy to stick around for a minute if there's any last minute questions. But as far as the formal presentation, I think we're done. And I hope everybody has a great rest of their day.
Thanks, everyone.